A cold farewell turns an entire relationship into ashes in a matter of minutes, leaving only the echo of words that hurt more than any scream. While one side believes they are freeing themselves from a failure, the other carries in silence a secret capable of turning all of reality upside down. Between ambition, appearance, and hasty decisions, fate begins to draw a twist as powerful as it is inevitable, and when the truth finally emerges, it does not ask for explanations. It only exposes who knew how to wait and who did not know how to see. Before discovering how this surprising story unfolds to the last detail, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and follow more intense reports like this one. The apartment in Brooklyn had large windows that overlooked the city, but Henrique Tavares rarely opened them, not out of disdain for the landscape, but because the time it would take to contemplate São Paulo was time he could spend on the code that grew silent on his screen. It had been like this for 3 years. He woke up before the sun, prepared coffee without making a sound, and settled into his work chair even before the city awakened. There was an almost monastic discipline in that routine, a dedication that only someone with absolute conviction in their own work could sustain for so long. Renata woke up that Tuesday morning with her expression already closed. Henrique noticed the sign even before she opened her mouth. There was a pattern in that silence, dense, heavy, different from the productive silence he himself cultivated. It was the silence of someone who had decided something during the night and was only waiting for the right moment to pronounce it. She served herself coffee without looking at him. She stood with her back turned for a long time, her hand resting on the kitchen counter, her shoulders slightly raised as if sustaining an invisible weight. When she finally turned, her eyes did not have the hesitation that usually precedes difficult words. They were eyes already resolved. "I want a divorce, Henrique." He did not respond immediately. He placed his cup on the table with care, looked at her with the same attention he dedicated to an architecture problem in the system, and waited. He had learned over 4 years of marriage that Renata rarely said everything at once. There was always a second layer. "There is nothing left to save," she continued, her voice firm, almost clinical. "You spend your entire life locked in this room, Henrique, months and months without any result. I am not going to stay waiting for a turnaround that is never going to happen. The project is advancing. You always say that." She crossed her arms. 3 years hearing that it is advancing, and meanwhile, I work, I support this house, I pay the bills, and you stay here dreaming about a software that nobody asked for. Henrique took a deep breath. There was a concrete injustice in those words. He contributed with what he could during the development process, and they both knew it. But confronting her at that moment would be useless. Renata was not in dialogue mode. She was in closure mode. "If it is what you want," he said finally. She seemed to have expected resistance, because its absence made her blink a few times. Then she recomposed her expression. "I hired a lawyer. Total separation of assets. You sign, each one moves on with what is theirs, and it's over." He nodded his head. There wasn't much to divide. The apartment was rented, the car was in her name, and the existing savings were modest. What Henrique possessed of true value was not in any bank statement. It was in 700,000 lines of code spread across a private server, in negotiation meetings that he conducted with absolute discretion, in conversations with investors that Renata never knew existed. He signed the agreement 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, without his own lawyer, without negotiation, without even rereading the clauses. He knew exactly what he was giving up and what he was protecting. Brooklyn emptied fast. Renata took the furniture she had chosen, the appliances she had bought with her own card, the decoration pieces that reflected a taste that had never been shared. What remained was an almost empty living room, a work desk, an ergonomic chair, and the server that hummed discreetly in the back room. For Henrique, it was enough. In the first few days, the absence weighed in a way he didn't expect. It wasn't a longing for Renata specifically. It was the presence of a different silence, more absolute, without the background noise that another human being in the same space inevitably produces. He worked more. It was the only antidote he knew for any form of discomfort. The software he was developing was called Fluxor. It was a logistics management system designed for medium-sized companies operating with multiple distribution centers, a specific problem he had identified during consulting work years before. Most solutions available on the market were too generic or too expensive for this segment. Fluxor filled that gap with a lean, adaptable architecture and an interface that any operations manager could master in less than a week. He knew it was good. More than good. It was exactly what a specific set of companies needed, and it didn't yet exist on the market in that format. What Renata never understood, and what Henrique never tried to explain with the necessary depth, was that building something of this size alone was not laziness disguised as ambition. It was a form of work that did not produce visible signs in the first years. There were no meetings in formal attire, there were no printed reports on the desk, there was no performative vocabulary that she associated with success. There was only a man and a screen, night after night, building something that the world didn't yet know it needed. A week after the divorce was formalized, Henrique moved to a studio in Pinheiros. It was smaller, noisier, with a window that faced a ventilation shaft. It cost less, and every real saved was reinvested in the project's infrastructure. He set up the chair, connected the server, prepared the coffee, and went back to work as if the Brooklyn apartment had never existed. It wasn't coldness, it was focus. That same week, Renata published on social media the first photograph of the new phase. She was at a restaurant with a Japanese name in Vila Nova Conceição, next to a man in a dark suit and a wide smile. The caption said only, "New Beginnings." Henrique saw the image by accident while scrolling through the profile in search of an old photo he needed for a document. He looked for a few seconds, closed the app, and went back to the code terminal. There was a meeting scheduled for the following week. An investment fund based in Itaim Bibi had requested a technical presentation of Fluxor after seeing the documentation he had discreetly distributed at a logistics event 3 months earlier. It wasn't the first meeting of this type. There had been others with results that varied between genuine interest and polite indifference. But this time there was something different in the tone of the exchanged emails, an objectivity that suggested the interlocutor on the other side had already made a preliminary decision and only needed confirmation. Henrique slept 6 hours that night, which for him was almost luxury. He woke up with the city still dark, prepared the coffee and opened the laptop. On the screen, Fluxor waited, patient, solid, built brick by brick during years of silence that no one had understood. He put on his headphones, chose an instrumental playlist he used when he needed absolute concentration, and dove into the work. Outside, São Paulo began another day. Inside the studio in Pinheiros, something much larger than a day was about to begin. The meeting room of the fund Vertice Capital had a view of Itaim Bibi and glass walls that let in a light that Henrique found excessive for the type of conversation he was about to have. He arrived 15 minutes before the scheduled time, as was his habit, and spent that time mentally reviewing the points he would present. There were no elaborate slides, nor printed materials with gold logos. There was a laptop, a live demonstration of the system, and the numbers he had compiled during months of testing with 3 partner companies using beta versions of Fluxor. Flavia Drummond entered the room with the punctuality of someone who respects their own time. She was the fund's investment director, known in the market for a rare ability to distinguish a solid product from a well-packaged narrative. She had short hair, thin-framed glasses, and a way of sitting that suggested total attention without any visible effort. Beside her, Marcos Elias, a senior analyst, brought a notepad already filled with notes. "Henrique Tavares," she said, without a question mark, like someone confirming information. "I saw the technical documentation you distributed at the A-blog event. I was left with some questions. I am here to answer them." Flavia opened her laptop and pointed to a specific line in the document. "You claim that the system reduces order processing time by up to 42% in operations with more than 3 distribution centers. How was this measured?" Henrique connected his own laptop to the room's monitor and accessed the Fluxor panel in real time. He showed the logs of the 3 partner companies, without identifying them, as agreed in the confidentiality contract, the raw data from before and after implementation, and the methodology he had used to calculate the reduction. Flavia did not interrupt. Marcos made notes at a constant pace. The presentation lasted 40 minutes. At the end, there was a silence that Enrique had already learned to read. It wasn't discomfort, it was evaluation. "Do you have a partner?" Flavia asked. "No." "Did you develop everything alone?" "Yes, with the exception of 2 integration modules that I outsourced to a company in Campinas last year." She exchanged a look with Marcos, brief and loaded. "We will need a week for internal analysis," she said, standing up. "But I can say in advance that what we saw today is consistent with what we expected to find, and a bit beyond that." Enrique left Vertice Capital at 11:45 in the morning, went down the glass elevator overlooking the marble lobby, and walked to the sidewalk of Rua Leopoldo Couto de Magalhães. The late October sun was hitting hard. He put on his sunglasses, checked for messages on his phone, and called a transport app. There was nothing extraordinary about his posture at that moment, but there was, somewhere inside him, a kind of certainty that was starting to take solid shape. The following week, Renata's lawyer got in touch. There was an item that had remained pending in the divorce agreement, the car, a medium-sized sedan that was formerly in Henrique's name, but which Renata had fully financed. She wanted the immediate transfer. The lawyer used the polite tone that professionals in that area cultivate to communicate demands. Henrique asked for a day to think. Not because he needed it, the decision was already made before finishing the call, but because giving an immediate answer would seem like carelessness, and he was not careless. The next day, he replied that he agreed to the transfer without contestation. The lawyer thanked him with an efficiency that suggested he had expected resistance and was slightly surprised by its absence. Renata learned of the response that same afternoon. According to what reached Henrique weeks later, through a mutual friend who still kept in touch with both, she had celebrated. She described the handing over of the car as definitive proof that she had made the right choice. The man simply didn't have the backbone to defend what was his. Henrique knew this and felt no anger. He felt something closer to confirmation. He had given up the car because disputing it would cost time, energy, and attention that needed to be elsewhere. The meeting with Vertice Capital had been promising, but there were other potential investors in parallel, and each one required specific attention. There was also a negotiation with a medium-sized distributor from Ribeirão Preto that wanted to implement Fluxor as its main operations system. It was the type of contract that, well structured, would serve as a proof of concept for any investor who still had doubts. The days in Pinheiros acquired a cadence of their own. Henrique woke up early, worked in 3-hour blocks with short breaks, had lunch at a pay-by-weight restaurant 2 blocks from the studio where everyone already knew him by his order, went back to work, and at night read contracts and technical documentation until his eyes began to grow heavy. It was a small life on the outside and an enormous one on the inside. Sometimes, in moments of pause, he thought about what Renata had said on the morning of the divorce, that he had no visible results. The word that stuck was that one, visible. As if a result that couldn't be photographed and posted wasn't a result. There was a logic of its own in that world she inhabited, a world where the value of a thing was measured by its capacity to be displayed. He did not live in that world. He never had. On the 12th day after the meeting, Flavia Drummond sent an email. It was direct without preamble. "We would like to move forward with a formal proposal. Can you confirm availability for a second meeting this week?" Henrique read it twice, closed the email, and went back to the code he was reviewing. There was a security update that needed to be implemented before any negotiation moved forward. The response could wait 2 hours. The work could not. That night, after sending the confirmation and with the date of the second meeting already set, he went out for a walk along Enrique Schaumann. The street was busy, bars full, the collective noise of a city that doesn't stop. He walked for 40 minutes, without a defined destination, breathing the air that smelled of wet asphalt and street food, and thought that there was something deeply right about being there, at that moment, exactly that way. No car, no balcony apartment, no one by his side, and with everything that mattered still intact. There was a kind of strange freedom in that. During the marriage, even without clearly noticing, he had cultivated the habit of measuring his own progress by Renata's yardstick. She didn't ask about Fluxor with genuine curiosity. She asked to confirm if there was something that justified the time he spent locked in the room, and since the answer never came in the format she recognized as valid, her conclusion was always the same. There was nothing. He had internalized that dynamic to the point of, at times, doubting his own trajectory. It was a subtle weight, almost invisible, but real. Now, walking alone along Henrique Schaumann, without having to justify to anyone where he was or what he had done during the day, he felt that weight absent. The space it had left was, paradoxically, productive, as if the removal of a constant pressure allowed something that had been bent to slowly return to its correct shape. He stopped in front of an open bakery, ordered a glass of orange juice at the counter, and stayed there for a few minutes observing the movement of the street. A couple passed hand in hand. A delivery rider on a bicycle cut across the curb with agility. Two men were talking animatedly on the sidewalk opposite, with the characteristic gesturing of those discussing something passionate. The city was indifferent, as always, and there was an immense comfort in that indifference. São Paulo didn't ask for explanations. It didn't judge anyone's pace. It just moved forward and dragged along whoever knew how to keep up. Henrique finished the juice, left the glass on the counter, and resumed his way back to the studio. He had work waiting. He always did. And for the first time in a long time, that didn't seem like a burden. It seemed simply like the life he had chosen, and that was finally starting to respond. The second meeting at Vertice Capital lasted 2.5 hours. This time there were more people in the room. Besides Flavia and Marcos, 2 other partners of the fund were present, and an external consultant specialized in technology for supply chain. Henrique answered every question with the precision of someone who had thought about those same issues for years. There was no improvisation. There was depth. At the end, Flavia asked him to wait outside for a few minutes. Henrique went out into the hallway, accepted a glass of water from an assistant, and stood facing the window observing the flow of cars on the avenue below. 20 minutes passed. When Flavia opened the door again, there was something different in her posture, a slight relaxation in the line of her shoulders that he interpreted correctly. "We are interested in structuring a license acquisition proposal with a minority stake in the company," she said. "I'll be direct. It's a significant value. We need 2 more weeks to finalize the terms, but I want to know now if you are willing to sit at the table." Henrique placed the glass of water on the assistant's tray with care. "I am," he replied. He left the building and walked to Ibirapuera Park, which was a 20-minute walk away. There was no practical reason to go to the park at that moment, but there was a need he didn't quite know how to name, perhaps to be in an open place with trees where the size of what was happening could exist without walls around it. He sat on a bench near the lake, took off his glasses and stayed for a while looking at nothing in particular. The proposal from Vertice was not the only one in progress. There was a second negotiation conducted by a trusted intermediary with a business group from Ribeirão Preto that sought to modernize the entire logistics infrastructure of its distributors. This contract, if closed, would represent the first large-scale implementation of Fluxor and would function as a showcase for any investor who still needed concrete proof. The 2 negotiations were running in parallel, and Henrique had been careful so that they didn't know about each other, not out of dishonesty, but because competitive pressure, when managed with discretion, usually accelerated decisions. While he sat in the park mentally reorganizing the next steps, Renata posted her 13th photograph of the month. It was a dinner on the top floor of a hotel in the expanded center, with São Paulo illuminated in the background and a wine glass in the foreground. The man beside her, Eduardo Salgado, as Henrique had learned from the mutual friend, appeared partially framed, his face cut off by the edge of the image with the calculated imprecision of someone who wants the other to exist in the photo without it appearing purposeful. The caption said, "The life I always deserved." Henrique no longer saw Renata's profile. He hadn't blocked her. He had simply stopped looking. in the same way one stops looking for something that is no longer missed. The person who told him about the posts was Deborah, his younger sister, who lived in Campinas and called on Wednesdays with a mix of genuine concern and the slightly guilty pleasure of someone following a drama closely. She posted again, Deborah said, that Wednesday. "With that man, don't you want to know who he is?" "I already know who he is." "And it doesn't bother you?" Henrique was preparing rice when his sister called, and he continued stirring the pan while he answered. "No. Hen, are you really okay, or are you doing that thing of yours where you pretend you're okay?" "I'm really okay." Deborah was silent for a moment, evaluating. "Okay. But you need to go out once in a while. You're living like a monk in that studio. A monk works in silence and produces results. I don't see the problem." She laughed, a bit frustrated. "You are impossible. Call me next Wednesday." He hung up, served the rice, and went back to the laptop. There was a system performance report that needed to be reviewed before being sent to the Vertice consultant. It was meticulous work, the kind that required total attention, and he liked exactly that type of work. The kind that didn't admit distraction, that revealed quality or weakness without room for narrative. The following days were intense. There was a technical visit to the distributor in Ribeirão Preto, where Henrique spent 2 days following the operations team, understanding the real workflow, identifying the friction points that Fluxor would need to resolve. It was the part of the process he liked most, the contact with the concrete reality behind any technical abstraction. The operations manager of the distributor, a man named Claudio, who had 30 years of experience in the sector and a natural distrust of anything coming from São Paulo, spent the first day testing Henrique with progressively more specific questions. On the second day, Claudio was sitting beside him, suggesting improvements. Back at the studio in Pinheiros, Henrique incorporated the field observations into an update he sent to Vertice Capital as part of the supplementary documentation. Flavia replied with a 2-line email. "Received. This strengthens the proposal considerably." That night, while the studio was silent and São Paulo functioned outside with its constant noise, Henrique opened a drawer and took out a hardcover notebook where he had written, 3 years earlier, the initial idea for Fluxor. It was a common notebook from a stationery store with the cover a bit crumpled. The first page had a diagram made in pen, with circles and arrows and notes in small handwriting that barely fit the lines. It was the embryo of everything. He stayed looking at that page for a few minutes. Then he closed the notebook, returned it to the drawer, and went to sleep. There was still much to come. But the path that had begun on that page was, finally, getting somewhere. The next morning he woke up with a text message from a number he didn't recognize immediately. It was short. A woman named Patricia from Bravo Logistica had seen the presentation at ABLog and wanted to talk about a possible partnership. He stayed looking at the message for a few seconds. Bravo was a medium-sized company with operations in the interior of São Paulo and southern Minas Gerais. Henrique knew the name. He had studied the sector with enough depth to map the main players. Contacts that arrive spontaneously, especially from someone who saw a presentation and took the initiative, carry a level of interest that is difficult to manufacture. He replied, accepting a coffee for the following week. That morning also brought an update from the lawyer, who had discreetly reviewed the divorce agreement months before. It was a technical procedure related to the registration of the company being formed to receive the investment from Vertice Capital. The legal structure mattered. The right choice protected what had been built and defined with precision what belonged to whom, without room for future interpretation. Henrique responded with 3 objective questions and went back to the code. The studio in Pinheiros had become a kind of silent operations center. No one passing through the door would have any way to imagine what was being built there. The desk was simple, the walls bare. The only element that betrayed the seriousness of the work was the server in the back room running uninterruptedly with a low hum that Henrique had stopped hearing consciously, like someone who stops noticing the sound of their own heart. Sometimes in the intervals between blocks of work, he walked through the neighborhood. There was a bookstore on Rua dos Pinheiros where he used to stop, leafing through books without intention to buy, just to interrupt the mental circuit for a few minutes. The owner of the bookstore had learned not to ask if he needed help. He just nodded when Enrique entered and went back to what he was doing. It was this type of relationship he preferred in that phase: presence without requirement, company without demand. There was something that the marriage had worn down in him, not the capacity to connect, but the tolerance for relationships that cost more than they offered. Renata had demanded over 4 years a version of himself that he simply was not. He had tried, out of honesty, to approach that version. The effort had been real, but there is a point where trying to be what one is not consumes more energy than any professional project could justify. Now, in that small studio, without having to perform anything for anyone, he recognized himself more clearly than in years. There were 11 days left until the deadline Vertice Capital had set for the formal proposal. Enrique already knew what he would accept and what he would negotiate. He had done the calculations. He had studied similar contracts. And there was, more than anything, clarity about the value of what he had built. Not the value someone would attribute to him, but the real value calculated based on data, on market, on verifiable potential. This clarity was the most precious asset he possessed, and it was an asset that no divorce agreement could have reached. Patricia Alencar had the kind of objectivity that develops in someone who has spent years managing real operations, with real deadlines and margins that do not forgive imprecision. She had been the commercial director of Bravo Logistica for 6 years, and she had reached that position not by inheritance of the post, but by a combination of technical competence and a rare ability to translate an operational problem into financial language. When they met at a bakery cafe in the Jardins neighborhood, she had suggested the place, which Enrique interpreted as a sign that it was she who controlled the pace of the conversation. The presentation lasted less than 2 minutes. "I saw your presentation at A-Blog and tested the demo you made available on the site," she said directly. "It works. I have 3 questions before anything else." He nodded. "First, the integration module with legacy systems. Have you tested it with SAP?" "With SAP Business One, and with a proprietary system of a distributor in Ribeirão Preto that has an architecture similar to SAP R2. Second, average onboarding time for the operations team, 5 days for basic functional use, 10 days for complete mastery. Third, post-implementation technical support, included in the first 12 months. From then on, a separate contract with an SLA defined by the size of the operation." Patricia noted the 3 answers with a ballpoint pen in a small notepad she took from her bag. She looked up. "Can I present this internally?" "Yes." She closed the notepad. "Great. I will need a commercial proposal by the end of the week." The coffee lasted 20 minutes. When Enrique left, there were 3 negotiations in progress simultaneously: Vertice Capital, the distributor from Ribeirão Preto, and now Bravo Logistica. It was more than he had had at any previous moment. It was also more than he could manage alone comfortably, which meant that the phase of completely solo work was coming to an end. He would need to hire. It was a stage he had postponed for practical reasons. Lean structure, no overhead, maximum agility. But the simultaneous growth of 3 fronts made the postponement impossible. That afternoon, Enrique called Gustavo, a developer he had worked with years before at a consulting firm. He was someone he trusted technically and who had demonstrated, in the few times they had met since then, genuine interest in Fluxor. The conversation was direct. There was a position available, compensation below market in the short term, with a share in the results in the medium term, and an immediate start. Gustavo asked for 48 hours to think. He called back in 24. At the same time, in another neighborhood of the city, Renata's life followed a trajectory that she had not yet realized was tilted in the wrong direction. Eduardo Salgado was exactly what he appeared to be in the photographs: well-dressed, articulate, with a vocabulary of success that knew the right terms at the right time. What the photographs did not show was what Renata did not yet know: that life of dinners and trips was sustained not by consolidated wealth, but by a combination of revolving credit, informal agreements with suppliers, and a reputation that had begun to crack at the edges. She learned of the first sign when the card Eduardo had promised to pay, a hotel bill in Gramado, where they had spent a weekend, returned without settlement. Eduardo explained with ease, talking about temporary cash flow, an investment that was about to close, in the fluent vocabulary of someone who had given that explanation before. Renata believed it. She had learned to believe in the language of success. It was, after all, the language she herself valued. Meanwhile, Enrique finished the commercial proposal for Bravo Logistica in 2 days, sent it, and received a response from Patricia in less than 6 hours. There was interest, they asked for adjustments in 2 points, and they wanted a face-to-face meeting for the following week. He confirmed and went back to the negotiation with Vertice, which had entered the technical due diligence phase, an audit of the code, architecture, and documentation of Fluxor conducted by a specialized company hired by the fund. The due diligence lasted a week. Enrique followed every step with attention, responding promptly to every request for documentation without hesitation. It was the type of process that exposes weaknesses where they exist, and he knew that Fluxor's weaknesses were minimal. He had built the system with the awareness that one day someone would look at every detail. The report arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Flavia forwarded it with a line of comment. Result as expected. Can we schedule the presentation of the final proposal? They met the following Monday. The proposal was on the table. Acquisition of an exclusive license for the distribution segment, with revenue between 50 and 500 million, a minority stake in the company with the right to dividends, and an advance that would transform Enrique's financial reality immediately and permanently. He listened to the numbers with the same expression with which he listened to any other technical information. He asked 3 questions about the governance structure. He asked for 2 days to review with the lawyer. Flavia agreed with a nod that contained, for the first time since they had met, something close to a smile. In those 2 days, Enrique did not sleep more than 5 hours a night. Not from anxiety, from work. There were contractual details that needed attention, clauses that needed to be adjusted, and an email from the distributor in Ribeirão Preto that had formalized the implementation contract in the same week. 3 fronts closing at the same time, each requiring precision. On the afternoon of the second day, he signed the proposal from Vertice Capital. He left the lawyer's office, crossed Rua Hungria with the sun setting over the buildings of Itaim, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. There was no one to call. Deborah would be happy, but the call could wait until night. Gustavo, who had formally started working that week, would know soon through the practical developments. There was no need to announce anything. He put his phone in his pocket and started walking. The city around him was the same as always, noisy, indifferent, in constant motion. But there was something different in the way he crossed it at that moment, like someone who finally feels firm ground under their feet after a long time walking on an unstable surface. Fluxor was real. The result was real, and it belonged entirely to him. That night, he finally called Deborah. She answered on the second ring, with that voice that carried simultaneously the concern of a younger sister and the curiosity of someone following a story closely. "Done," he said simply. There was a pause. "Done how?" Deborah asked. "The contract with Vertice I signed today." Another silence, longer. Then a sound he identified as her covering her face with her hand, the way she had of processing big news. "Hen. How much?" He gave the number. Her reaction was a mix of laughter and something close to a sob, the type of response that doesn't quite know in which direction to go. They talked for almost an hour, the longest in months. Deborah asked practical questions, the type that revealed she had understood the magnitude without needing him to explain twice. At the end, she said something that stayed with him after he hung up. "You never doubted, right? Even when everything indicated you should doubt." He thought for a moment before answering. "I doubted quite a bit, but doubting the process is different from abandoning it." She was quiet, then said she was proud. He thanked her, hung up, and sat in the studio with the silence back. Outside, São Paulo continued its nocturnal hum, distant sirens, sparse horns, the occasional roar of a motorcycle accelerating on the nearby expressway. Enrique opened the laptop and, instead of going back to work, opened a spreadsheet he rarely consulted. It was a history he had kept since the beginning of the project. Dates, milestones, hours worked per week, problems encountered, and solutions implemented. A quantitative backbone of 3 years of invisible work. He scrolled through the lines slowly, from beginning to end. He saw there the anatomy of something that had cost more than money. It had cost isolation, misunderstanding, the dissolution of a marriage that perhaps had never had enough base to survive the pressure of the process. Each line represented a day when he had chosen to continue when the easier choice would have been to stop. There was no heroism in that. It was simply the consequence of knowing what he was building and having decided that it was worth going to the end. He closed the spreadsheet, turned off the light, and went to sleep earlier than usual. For the first time in a long time, there was no urgency pushing sleep to later. There was, on the contrary, a kind of permission to rest, like placing a weight carried for a long time on the floor and staying for a moment simply still, recognizing how much it weighed. The news was not announced. There was no press release, no note to the press, no type of disclosure that people of a certain social circle usually orchestrate to transform achievement into a spectacle. What happened was more discreet and for that very reason more inevitable. The market found out. In São Paulo, especially in the technology and logistics ecosystem that Henrique had inhabited for the last few years, relevant information travels through the right channels before reaching public channels. The formalization of the contract with Vertice Capital was recorded in the corporate documents of the newly formed company, and those documents, by their nature, are not secret. They just aren't widely publicized. Those who know where to look, find. And there is always someone who knows where to look. The first sign arrived through Gustavo, who in the second week of work received a contact from a former colleague asking for information about Fluxor. Henrique guided him to respond with the standard documentation and to direct any commercial interest to the formal channel. The second sign was an email from a magazine specialized in technology asking for an interview. The third, more revealing, was a call from Claudio, the operations manager of the distributor in Ribeirão Preto, informing him that 2 direct competitors had asked which system he was implementing. "You're going to need a better website," said Gustavo one afternoon when they were working together in the studio, "and someone to take care of communication." Henrique agreed without enthusiasm. The part of the work that involved visibility had never been his favorite. He understood its necessity, especially now, with growth becoming inevitable. But there was something in the way the world demanded that success be displayed that continued to bother him. It wasn't calculated modesty. It was a genuine resistance to transforming results into performance. They hired a communications professional recommended by Flavia from Vertice. She was competent, direct, and had the intelligence to understand, after a single meeting with Henrique, that the tone of her work would need to reflect the substance of the product, not the shine of who created it. It was at this time that Renata found out, not through Henrique and not in a direct way. She found out through the mutual friend, the same channel that had operated in both directions since the divorce, who had seen Henrique Tavares's name in a logistics sector publication. The article was technical, focused on the product, but mentioned the value of the negotiation with Vertice Capital clearly enough for anyone to understand what had happened. The mutual friend, Rodrigo, who worked in finance and had the uncomfortable habit of sharing information he perhaps shouldn't, sent the article to Renata by message with a neutral comment. "I saw that Henrique closed something big." She read it 3 times. There was in the reading a progression of states that she could not control. First surprise, then incredulity, then something harder to name, a kind of forced recalibration of a narrative she had carefully constructed over the previous months. The narrative said that Henrique was a man who had wasted years on an illusion, that the divorce had been not only correct, but a kind of personal salvation, that she had escaped in time. The article, with its numbers and its citations and its objective existence on the cell phone screen, said something else. She called Rodrigo, who confirmed with the objectivity of someone who had sent the message without anticipating the impact. "It's the software he kept developing," he said. "Logistics. It seems it was really solid." "It seems," she repeated, her voice controlled with the visible effort of someone holding something back. She hung up and stayed looking at the screen for a long time. In that same period, Eduardo Salgado's reality had begun to reveal its real structure. The second unpaid bill had been followed by a third, and the explanation about temporary cash flow had begun to lose the fluidity of before. Renata had started asking questions that Eduardo answered with that specific skill of transforming an answer into a new question, of deviating without the deviation seeming like a deviation. It was a technique she had admired at the beginning as sophistication, and that now with more calibrated eyes she recognized for what it was. She had asked him to show something concrete, a statement, a document, anything that gave substance to what he described as capital tied up in high-return investments. Eduardo had promised it for the following week. The week passed, then another. While waiting, she went back to the article about Fluxor, read it again, calculated, thought about the total separation of assets agreement she herself had demanded, drafted by her lawyer, signed by Henrique without contestation on a Thursday afternoon. She had celebrated as a victory. She understood for the first time with total clarity what that signature had meant for him, and what it had meant for her. There was an irony there that was almost too structural to be accidental. She had demanded the total separation, convinced she was protecting what she had. He had signed convinced he was protecting what he was building. Both had achieved exactly what they wanted. The difference was that one of the two had built on a real foundation, and the other on the illusion of what the present showed. Renata placed the cell phone on the table, went to the window and looked at the street below. The city followed indifferent, as always. There was no particular consolation in that indifference, but there was, paradoxically, a clarity that begins to emerge when the narratives we build about ourselves begin to crack at the edges and let in the light of what really happened. She still didn't know what to do with that clarity, but it was there, firm and uncomfortable, refusing to go away. In the following days, Renata tried to maintain her routine. She worked, answered emails, attended social engagements with her usual composure, but there was a new restlessness that crossed everything, a kind of fissure in the structure of the certainty she had carefully cultivated since the divorce. She had built, with much effort, a narrative in which she was the lucid protagonist of a brave decision. She had left a relationship with no future. She had started over with someone who represented exactly what she valued. She had proven, to herself and to those who followed her on social media, that she had made the right choice. The article about Fluxor did not undo this narrative in a direct way, but it questioned it, and questioning, when it falls upon a structure built more on conviction than on evidence, has the slow and inexorable power of water over stone. There was a question she couldn't push away. If she had known, on that morning, when she pronounced the word divorce with her shoulders raised and her eyes already resolved, what was being built in that room, would she have waited? The honesty she found when she forced herself to answer was uncomfortable. Perhaps yes, not out of love. She had been honest with herself about what had remained of love at that point, but out of interest. And that honesty, in itself, said something about the nature of the choice she had made. It hadn't been, as she had believed, a brave choice. It had been a bet, and like every bet, it depended on the information available at the moment the decision was made. She had bet on the present. Henrique had invested in the future. The result was in the article she had read 3 times. Eduardo didn't show up that weekend. He sent a message saying an unavoidable commitment had arisen. She replied with an objectivity that made him ask, for the first time in months, if everything was okay. She said yes, but there was something different in the way she spent that Saturday alone in the apartment, with the phone quiet and her thoughts in motion, something that looked like, beneath the hurt and confusion, the beginning of an honest and delayed evaluation. Renata's lawyer was named Fabio Mendes, and she had originally hired him for the divorce with the confidence of someone delegating a task they don't want to examine closely. Now, sitting on the other side of his desk in an office in Paraiso, she was there with a different intention, and with a question she had taken 3 weeks to be able to formulate out loud. I want to know if there is any legal basis to claim a share in the assets Henrique has built. Fabio looked at her with the balanced expression of someone who has heard this request before. The total separation of assets agreement you signed. I know what I signed. I want to know if there is any loophole. He opened the folder with the divorce documents, which she had brought with her, and spent a few minutes rereading the clauses in silence. He was a meticulous man, the type who doesn't answer before being sure. When he looked up, there was a frankness in his expression that she recognized as the anteroom to a bad answer. Renata, the agreement you signed is one of the most closed I have ever seen in this type of case. You yourself requested the total separation. The drafting was done by your previous firm and he signed without contestation. There is no loophole. Any attempt at contestation would be filed away before reaching a hearing. She listened without changing her expression. And if I argue that the software was developed during the marriage period, the development may have started during the marriage, but the company and the contract with the investment fund were formed after the date of the divorce. The asset that generated the value is formally constituted after the separation. He paused. Furthermore, for there to be any argument about contribution to assets during the marriage, you would need to demonstrate that there was financial input or joint work in the development of the software. Would you have a way to demonstrate that? Renata's silence answered before the words. No, she said finally. Then there is no viable legal path. She thanked him, paid for the consultation, and left. Rua Vergueiro was busy in the late afternoon, with the characteristic noise of rush hour settling over the city. She walked to the subway station without haste, the weight of the conversation settling with that peculiar lightness that sometimes accompanies the confirmation of what was already known. She had tried. The attempt had met the exact consequence of a choice she herself had made, with conviction, with pride, with the certainty of protecting what was hers. The total separation agreement had been her idea, her demand, her instrument. And it had worked exactly as it should, protecting what each had built, cleanly and irrevocably. That week, she sent another message to Henrique, this time more direct. Can I ask you for a coffee, just to talk? No agenda. The response arrived the next day, shorter than she expected. You can. Send me your availability. They met on a Thursday afternoon at a cafe in Villa Madalena that Henrique had suggested, near the co-working space where he worked, which she interpreted as a sign that he hadn't rearranged his schedule for the meeting. When she arrived, he was already sitting, with a glass of water and his cell phone face down on the table. He wore a simple shirt, without the tie or suit she had, for reasons she couldn't explain, half expected. It was the same Enrique, only more present somehow, as if the space around him had become more defined. Thank you for agreeing to come, she said, sitting down. Sure. There came the silence that usually precedes conversations that have no established protocol. She ordered a coffee. He waited. I heard about Fluxa, she began. I read the article. And then I went after more information. Yes. I want to be honest with you. I prefer that. She took a deep breath. I was wrong in the way I left. Not in the divorce itself. I think we both knew it wasn't working. But in the way. In the things I said. In what I believed about you. Henrique listened without interrupting, with that attention she had during the marriage, mistaken for passivity, and which she now recognized as something else entirely. The attention of someone who really listens, because they don't need to prepare an answer while the other speaks. I believed you were wasting time, that there was nothing real in it. She stopped, and I was wrong. You were, he said simply, without cruelty, without satisfaction. I went to a lawyer, she said, and there was in her voice something that sounded like a deliberate effort of total honesty. I wanted to know if there was a legal basis to claim something. Henrique did not show surprise. She noticed that. There isn't, she continued. And when Fabio explained why to me, I realized that the agreement I myself demanded is what completely excludes me. It was I who wanted the total separation. Yes. Did you know that was going to happen? When you signed? He thought for a moment before answering. It was a question that deserved honesty, and he knew it. I knew the agreement protected me. I didn't know exactly what would come after, but I knew that any discussion at that moment would delay something that couldn't be delayed. And I knew you had demanded the terms. It wasn't my role to change what you had asked for. She nodded slowly, processing. You could have told me that there was something being built, that it wasn't an illusion. I could have, he agreed, but you weren't asking questions that I could answer with honesty without you staying for the wrong reasons, and I didn't want that. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who finally speak from the right place, without agenda, without performance, without the pressure of a relationship that demands words produce the expected result. She finished her coffee. He asked for the bill. Outside, a fine rain had begun to fall over Villa Madalena, wetting the sidewalks with that softness typical of autumn afternoons in São Paulo. For a moment, neither of them moved to leave. They just stayed there, with the rain outside and the conversation settled between them like something that had finally found its place. When they went out, the rain had intensified slightly. Henrique had an umbrella. She didn't. He opened it and held it between the two for a moment, not as a calculated gesture, but as a natural reflex. The type of thing 4 years of living together installs in gestures before the head thinks. She noticed the gesture. He also noticed that he had done it. You can keep it, he said, handing it over. I live nearby. She accepted. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment, with the rain around and the street of Villa Madalena full of the damp movement of the late afternoon. Henrique, she said. He waited. I'm sorry. Truly. Not for the circumstances. I understand that the circumstances produced what they needed to produce. But for the words I used, what I said about you on that day. He looked at her for a moment. There was in his expression something she didn't know how to fully name. It wasn't performative forgiveness. It wasn't coldness. It wasn't the indifference she feared finding. It was something closer to peace. The peace of someone who has already processed what they needed to process and no longer carries the weight that the other person was still carrying. I hear that, he said, and I hold nothing. She nodded. There were tears she held back with the effort of someone who knows that this was not the moment for them, and that she would have to find another space for what she was feeling. He noticed the effort, and out of respect for it, did not say anything else that could undo it. Go well, he said finally, and walked along the wet sidewalk toward the co-working space. She stood still for a moment, the umbrella open over her head, watching his silhouette pull away among the people walking hurriedly under the rain. There was something definitive in that scene, not tragic, but definitive. The closing of a chapter that had remained technically open for too long, for lack of courage from both to have the conversation they had just had. Now it was closed, and paradoxically in the closing, there was more dignity than there had been at any moment of what came before. She turned in the opposite direction and walked toward the subway. The city was wet and noisy, and completely indifferent to what had happened in that cafe. But she carried, under the borrowed umbrella, the strange lightness of someone who finally said what needed to be said, and heard back a truth that wasn't comforting, but was real. And the real, she was beginning to learn, is always worth more than the comfortable. 6 months after signing the contract with Vertice Capital, Fluxa Technologia had 12 employees, 3 active implementation contracts, and a pipeline of negotiations that Flavia Drummond, in a quarterly meeting, described as above initial projections in speed and average contract value. Henrique listened to the evaluation with the same balance with which he had listened, months earlier, to the investment proposal numbers. He had learned, in that period, that success produces a noise of its own, meetings that multiply, decisions that arrive with urgency, people who emerge from contexts he barely remembered with suddenly renewed interest. It was a different noise from the productive silence of previous years, and it required an adaptation he was still making. What had changed, above all, was the scale. Fluxa had been built for a specific segment, but market validation was revealing that the product's logic applied to adjacent segments that he hadn't yet mapped. There were conversations underway with companies in the pharmaceutical sector and with a regional retail chain from the Northeast. Patricia Alencar, from Bravo, had become not just a client, but a kind of informal ambassador for the product, recommending it to other directors in the sector, with the authority of someone who had followed the implementation closely. His personal life had found a rhythm he recognized as his own. The studio in Pinheiros had given way to a larger apartment, also in Pinheiros, not out of ostentation, but out of practical necessity. There were nights when he needed to work late, and the distance between where he slept and where he worked mattered. The apartment had a balcony that overlooked the Agua Funda forest, and he had acquired the habit of drinking coffee there in the morning before opening his laptop. It was the only ritual of pause he allowed himself before the day geared up. Deborah had visited twice. On the second visit, she brought her boyfriend and spent a whole weekend in São Paulo for the first time in years. Enrique took them to dinner at a restaurant in Liberdade he had discovered by chance, without a reservation, without a photograph, without any need to document the moment. Deborah had noticed this and commented later, by message, "You've changed for the better. You're more you." He had saved that message. There was also, in that period, a change harder to name, something internal that the process of the last few months had operated with the slowness and permanence of transformations that really stay. He had built Fluxor convinced it was good enough to do what it intended. But there was a difference between this intellectual conviction and the concrete experience of seeing the product working in real operations, solving real problems for people who had no obligation to approve of what he had done. Claudio, the operations manager from Ribeirão Preto, had sent a message 3 weeks after the full implementation. It was a long message for Claudio's standards, who was a man of few words. It said essentially that the system had worked better than he had expected, that the team had adapted with a facility that had surprised him, and that there was something thought for those who really work, not for those who present slides. Enrique had reread that message about 4 times. It was the type of validation that had no market price. The conversation with Renata in Vila Madalena had stayed with him in a different way than he expected. Not with nostalgia. Nostalgia presupposes a desire to return, and he didn't have that. It had stayed with the clarity that he had been seen, finally, with precision, by someone who had refused to see him for years. There was something restorative in that clarity, even if it arrived too late to change anything. The past does not alter with revision, but revision, when honest, has a value of its own. He had thought in the days following that coffee about what he had said to her, that he didn't want her to stay for the wrong reasons. It was a phrase that had come out naturally, and that, examined later, revealed something about how he understood relationships. There was a fundamental difference, which he had learned at the cost of years, between being chosen for what one is and being chosen for what one has. The first form of choice sustains something real. The second is a bet on numbers, and numbers change. Renata had returned to São Paulo. She had never left, but she had returned in the sense of rebuilding, again, a life on more honest foundations. He knew this through Rodrigo, who continued operating as an involuntary channel of information. He learned that she had ended the relationship with Eduardo, that she had moved apartments, that she had gone back to investing in her own work, with a seriousness that, according to Rodrigo, had visibly changed the tone with which she talked about what she did. Enrique didn't feel pleasure from this, nor pity. He felt perhaps the neutral recognition that people are capable of learning when circumstances place them before enough. On a Friday afternoon, when the office had already emptied and he had stayed to finish a report, Gustavo knocked on the open door of the room. "Are you leaving soon?" "1 more hour." Gustavo entered, leaned against the doorframe with the look of someone who has something to say, but is still deciding whether to say it. "Can I ask you a personal question?" "You can." "Did you know from the beginning that it was going to work? Fluxor?" Enrique thought for a moment. "I knew the product was good. I didn't know if the market would agree in the time I needed." And if it hadn't agreed? He turned his chair slightly, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I would have continued until I found the right adjustment, or I would have found a technical reason sufficient to stop, but I wouldn't have stopped out of exhaustion or external pressure." Gustavo nodded slowly, like someone saving an answer for future use. "That's it," he said, and left. Enrique went back to the report. Outside, São Paulo prepared for Friday night, traffic intensifying, office lights going out floors below, the city changing frequency with the punctuality of a mechanism that doesn't need instructions to function. There was something he had learned in these months that was hard to articulate but that he felt with precision. The result people see is always the surface of a process they didn't see. The company, the contract, the numbers, all of that was real and concrete, but it was the last layer of something built long before in silence, on nights that no one had witnessed, on days when the only reason to continue was the conviction that what was being done had enough substance to reach this far. Those who abandon the process hardly have a right to the result, but those who stay, those who remain present, honest with the work, honest with themselves, discover eventually that the process was what mattered most. The report was ready at 7:40. He closed the laptop, turned off the lights and left. The city was waiting outside, as always, and he had the rare feeling of being exactly where he needed to be. The Friday night was mild, with that early autumn wind that São Paulo sometimes offers, as compensation for weeks of heat and pollution. Henrique walked the 6 blocks to the apartment without haste, with headphones on, and the instrumental playlist he used when he wanted to think without thinking, that state of passive processing, where things find their places without forcing the arrangement. He thought about Deborah. He thought about Claudio and the long email that had arrived from Ribeirão Preto. He thought about the conversation with Renata, under the rain in Vila Madalena, and the way she had returned the borrowed umbrella via message. She had left it at the co-working reception the next day, with a handwritten note of 3 words that said only, "Thank you, take care." He had kept the note, not out of sentimentality, but because there was something in it, in the slightly irregular handwriting of someone who writes by hand less often than they should, in the 3 words that said exactly what was necessary and nothing more. That seemed to him a dignified closing, the type of closing that life rarely offers with that precision. He arrived at the apartment, went to the balcony, and stood looking at the dark Agua Funda forest. The trees were visible only as black masses against the city's orange sky, but there was a presence in them that he had learned to appreciate, something that remained, independent of what happened in the city around it. There was a book on the table he had started and not finished. There was a dinner to organize with Gustavo and Marina the following week, a kind of informal celebration for the company's 6 months. There was, tomorrow, the whole Saturday to do whatever he wanted, without a meeting, without urgency, without any obligation to transform time into production. He stayed on the balcony for a few more minutes, with the gentle wind and the city in the background, and felt, not as a thought but as a physical state, that he had arrived somewhere. Not at the final destination, which probably doesn't exist, but at a point of solidity from which whatever came next would be built on a real foundation. And that, he discovered, was enough for a Friday night in São Paulo. 1 year after signing the contract with Vertice Capital, Fluxor Tecnologia was mentioned in a publication specialized in logistics innovation as one of the 10 Brazilian B2B technology companies with the highest growth in the medium-sized company segment. The article was half a page, with an ascending line graph and a quote from Flavia Drummond about the product's solidity. Henrique read it on his phone while waiting for the coffee to brew, standing in the kitchen of the apartment in Pinheiros, and then put down the phone and went to get the cup. The company had 23 employees. It had its own office in Itaim, an entire floor of a building he had rented, with the same objectivity with which he made any other operational decision. It was the necessary space, for the right price, in the right place. There was no frivolity in the choice, but there was also no performative modesty. It was simply what made sense. Gustavo had been promoted to CTO. Marina had grown within the development team with the speed that confirmed what Henrique had intuited from the start. Patricia Alencar, from Bravo Logistica, had accepted an informal invitation to join an advisory board, the first the company had formed, composed of 3 sector professionals with decades of real experience. Flavia Drummond participated in the quarterly meetings with the objectivity that had been her hallmark since the first contact. It was a structure that had grown organically, without a forced leap, without the artificial inflation of team and titles he had observed in other startups, and which invariably produced problems before producing results. Each person had arrived when there was a real need, with the necessary competence, and had found an environment that valued concrete work above noisy presence. There was, on that one-year anniversary, a small thing Henrique did without announcing it to anyone. He opened the drawer where he kept the hardcover notebook with the initial fluxor diagram on the first page, made in pen with circles and arrows and small handwriting that barely fit the lines. He looked at the page for a few minutes. Then he closed the notebook and put it back. He had thought about framing it. He had discarded the idea for the same reason he discarded any gesture whose primary purpose was the narrative about himself. The notebook didn't need to be a symbol. It already was what it was, the beginning of something that had become real because it had been treated with seriousness since before there was any external reason to do so. Deborah called that afternoon, as on most Wednesdays. The time had naturally migrated to Thursdays over the months, but the frequency had been maintained. They talked for half an hour about things that had nothing to do with any company, about the book she was reading, about a trip he had finally booked for the end of the year, the first in more than 3 years, to Chapada dos Veadeiros, without a laptop, without a server on call, without anything that required connection. "Are you going to be able to go 10 days without working?" she asked with the affectionate skepticism of someone who knows the person well. "I'm going to try." "That's progress," she said, and laughed. It was progress. It was the type of progress that doesn't appear on any graph, but that matters in the way things that transform, not what one has, but who one is, matter. That night before sleeping, Enrique thought of something he rarely managed to articulate with precision, but that he felt with clarity. There was a difference between building something to prove a point and building something because you believe in what you are doing. The first motivation is fragile. It depends on external recognition to sustain itself, and when that recognition doesn't arrive, it collapses. The second is robust in the same way that structures with a real foundation are robust, not because they resist everything, but because when they yield in a way that can be repaired. He had built Fluxor because he believed in it, not despite the lack of external recognition, but in a way completely independent of it. And perhaps it was exactly that which had allowed the work to reach where it did. The absence of the need for premature validation had created the space for the thing to grow in its own time, in the right direction, without the deformation that pressure for visibility usually causes in things that are still forming. Those who abandon the process hardly have a right to the result, but those who remain with honesty, with seriousness, with the willingness to cross the invisible time without a shortcut, discover that the result, when it comes, carries with it something that no other trajectory could have produced, the silent certainty that it was built the right way. End of story. If this story touched something in you, Enrique's persistence, the weight of Renata's choices, the long crossing between the silent beginning and the result that no one saw being built, then you already know that stories like this have a power that goes beyond entertainment. They make us stop, look at our own process and ask, am I building on a real foundation? Here on the channel, that is exactly what we do every week. Stories that don't make it easy, that demand you stay until the end, that reveal something true about how the choices we make today shape what we find tomorrow. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. The button is right there, and it takes a second that can bring weeks of stories like this one. Leave your like if Henrique deserved more credit than he received, and tell us in the comments, would you have signed that agreement without saying anything? We read everything. Until the next story.